You just spent weeks, or more likely months, or even possibly years searching for your dream property. You're a week away from closing, and it's time for the final walkthrough. In today's video, I'm going to share everything you need to know about the final walkthrough to ensure you're protecting your biggest purchase of your life. Hey guys, if you don't know me, my name is Jankowitz. I'm a realtor based in Cambridge and Somerville, Massachusetts. I've closed over 300 transactions in the last 3 years. If you guys like these videos, please hit that like button, please subscribe, share with your friends. Let's get into the video. Let's start real basic here. What is a final walkthrough? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a chance for you, the buyer, to walk through the property one last time before you sign on the dotted line. Typically happens the day of closing. In fact, I recommend to clients always aim for day of closing, not the day before, because you want to have it as close to closing as possible to minimize the gap of time where something could go wrong. And it's a chance for you to go through that property and verify that everything is just as you remembered it. So the next thing is, what are we doing while we're doing this final walkthrough? Like, what are we looking for? So I think there's a couple different layers to this. And I will note, every buyer's a little different. Some people are extremely thorough, in my opinion, maybe a little over the top, but to each their own. And other people are very loosey-goosey, maybe a little too loosey-goosey in my opinion. So, there's gonna be a bit of a range here, but there's a couple things that I would recommend all my buyer clients do. Starting with some really serious items to look for. And these are just the really glaring, obvious ones. Is there a giant hole in the wall? Is there mold growing where before everything was fine? Is there a giant broken window? We're looking for major visually glaring issues that weren't there when we were previously at the property, essentially. Next up, the essential systems. We want to make sure that on a high level, everything looks okay. So one thing that I really like to check is the water situation. Does the water heat up appropriately? Does it have a good flow to it? I like to turn on the water flow and make sure that it's flowing, draining properly, and that there's no leaking underneath the sink as well. When the water comes out, does it look normal or is it brown or a weird color? This sounds very basic, but occasionally you will find things when you do this. Is there any leaking in the basement? This is a big one. I have a couple closings I've had where in the basement there is a leaky pipe. And this is really, can be a scary thing. Thankfully, in my time, most of the time when I found a leak, it's been very small, it's been remedied by the seller quickly, and it's been a non-issue. Next, I like to quickly check the stove. Are all the burners working properly? I would not freak out if one doesn't work. Oftentimes, if a gas stove hasn't been on for a while, might take a little while, they might need to be lit the first time to get going. So don't panic, but definitely check to make sure all the burners are working appropriately. Back to the water again. In the basement, I also like to see what's going on with the sewer pipe. Does everything look clean and clear? Has there been any leaking or signs of mold somewhere in the basement that appears to be newer? That could be a sign of a potential sewer leak, which is not a fun experience to go through. What about the oil tank? If this is a property that uses oil heat or has an old oil tank, I always recommend looking underneath the tank. I had one closing where there's actually an oil leak underneath the tank. A small leak may not be a big deal, but if it's moderate or more, you run the potential for needing to get an environmental engineer in there, which can become a very costly and time-consuming cleanup. So you want to check these things to basically make sure that ultimately the seller remedies these things before you take possession of the property, because once you sign on the dotted line, it's going to be very, very hard to deal with any of these issues and have the seller get back involved, basically. Next one, and this might be the most common one, is the property vacant? I know, guys, this sounds really, really basic, but there's been multiple times where I come to a property and you go into the interior of the unit and there's a bunch of the owner's stuff there. And they might say, well, I'm working on getting it out. It'll be up by the end of the day. Well, what I would say in that case is let's schedule a time at the end of the day. And if we have to move closing an extra day, we may have to do that. It's ultimately up to the seller and the seller's agent to work together to ensure that the property is delivered completely vacant. So I like to go through the entire property, especially the kitchen and the cupboards, and make sure everything is completely cleared. Now, I wouldn't go totally nuts here. If there's some Windex in one of the cabinets underneath the sink, if there's some toilet paper or paper towel rolls, if in the fridge there's some water or some old ice basket, it's fine. It's not a big deal. But if you see lots and lots and lots of clutter, at some point you really have to draw a line and say, let's hold off here for a second. Another thing that I always search, I work with a lot of multifamilies. Oftentimes what you will find, especially for a multifamily where the seller has owned the property for 10 years plus, there's going to be a lot of stuff in the basement because tenants are leaving stuff there over years and years and years and years. And usually they just leave it for the next person. And now you are that next person and you have 10, 20, 30 plus years of stuff in the basement. You want to ensure that that stuff is basically cleared out. Again, I won't go crazy if there's 1 or 2 items. It's not the end of the world. That's my opinion. But if there's lots of stuff, you should do something about it. Also, the exterior. I like to walk the exterior of the property and make sure there are no surprises. Again, I wouldn't go crazy here. If there's some trash bags that are excess flow from the trash, my opinion, let it go. It's going to be okay. The next week when the trash comes again, you can fill those back up and you can get back on a good cycle. I would not go nuts over that. If there's 1 or 2 little pieces of wood on the side of the house, I won't go crazy. But if you go to the backyard and there's a lot of junk there, if there's a shed loaded up with stuff and it's going to be a real issue, that's another matter that needs to be resolved. Next up, appliances. You want to make sure the appliances are actually there. I actually had a situation once where I showed up to a final walkthrough and appliances were missing even though they were written into the offer. So of course, first you want to make sure your offer includes those appliances, which they should most of the time, but then also you want to make sure they're there and they're in good working order. So you want to test them, dishwashers, washer dryers you can't really do, but at least check the stove, maybe hit the microwave for a couple seconds, make sure everything's just basically working and it's actually there. You also want to ask for any warranty information. If it's a newer appliance, you want to make sure that you can still be covered by the warranty. And if they purchased any special warranty, you want to have access to that so it can carry over to you. If you have any manuals, that can be helpful, although most of the time you can just Google them. But you want to just make sure that everything is in place. You also want to make sure that your window treatments are still in place. Your light fixtures are still in place. Did they get swapped out with a new one? Occasionally that can happen. So you just want to be really thorough there. And finally, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if, the stove gets swapped out or there's a leak in the basement? How do we remedy this? Well, the answer is it kind of depends. If it's a smaller issue, the first step is not to panic, but to simply go to the seller's agent, work with your agent, and I do this all the time, and just explain what's going on and have them remedy the situation, and then have us come back and hopefully verify that what needed to get done was done, and then we can close on time. So that's the first step. I'd say 90 to 95% plus if there is an issue, which is pretty rare, honestly, but if there is, that we can get it resolved. But sometimes in special circumstances, there is another tool in our toolbox called the holdback. And what is the holdback? It basically says, I, the buyer, want to hold back a chunk of the closing amount and put it in escrow until this thing is remedied. An example would be if you're buying a 3-family property and all 3 fridges were gone. If that was the case and the fridges were written into the offer, well, yeah, you want to figure out roughly what is the cost for those 3 fridges, have a holdback and tell basically the seller, we're not going to pay you this amount until you get those fridges back in place, or we're going to have to negotiate some kind of closing credit that makes up for our cost of the fridges plus our time and effort to get this remedied. Again, this is a really extreme example, but basically a holdback is our friend to deal with these kind of situations in that maybe 1 or 2% chance that something weird like this happens. Same thing if, let's say, there's a sewer pipe burst and it's going to take a week to clean up. Well, we'd have to have some kind of holdback if we want to stay on track. The other thing is we're going to of course, pause closing and wait a couple days to get things fixed. It really kind of depends, but that can create a new set of problems. So we generally want to avoid that if we can. I hope that was helpful. I hope you guys feel a little more confident when going through your final walkthrough. I always prep my clients before the final walkthrough whenever I can so they understand what they're getting into. I also really like to attend these just to make sure that we're making sure that we're crossing our T's, dotting our I's, and that we're buying what was promised to us. Hopefully this was helpful. If you guys like this content, hit that subscribe button. Hit me up on Calendar if you guys have any questions about final walkthroughs or anything else, and I'll see you guys next time.